Hello, and here we go with the fifth episode of our monthly segment, Expert Library. This is a series where we get to hear some amazing lectures from subject experts around the world. In case you have missed it, we had Professor John Rakakis from the University of Stirling, United Kingdom, who gave a wonderful lecture on Shakespeare and tragedy in the fourth episode of Expert Library. Be sure to check it out, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to get updated about Litreal's future events. Now, Litreal is honored and pleased to have Dr. Jason Gulia to give a spectacular lecture on 18th century allegory. Dr. Gulya is a professor of English at Berkeley College, New York, USA. He is a researcher and course creator looking to transform the process of learning. He has also co-authored books that focus upon 18th century literature like Allegory Studies and Adapting the 18th Century. So, Dr. Gulya, welcome to Litreal's Expert Library. Yeah, pleased to have you with us. Can you give a brief introduction about yourself to our audience who are much eager to know who Dr. Jason Gulia actually is?
Sure. So what I can do, so is it okay if I share my screen and just walk through that a little bit?
Oh, okay. So you can share your screen right now. Sure, you can share your screen right now, Dr. Gulya.
So I will do that because I have, all right, so you're able to see it on your end?
Yes, it's, I can see it.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I will give just a very quick intro to myself. My talk is going to be transforming classic genre. What did allegory look like in 17th and 18th century Britain? So I have this giant picture of myself just to put it out there. So just very quick information about me. Some of this just repeats what Sakni has already mentioned. So my name is Dr. Jason Gulia. If it helps anyone in terms of pronunciation, it rhymes with Julia. So you can have Julia Gulya in the back of your head. I got my Ph.D. from Rutgers University in the US on the East Coast. And as Sakni mentioned, I am a professor of English at Berkeley College. My specialty is 17th and 18th century British literature. I'm also very interested in teaching, in pedagogy, as well as film studies, and that kind of informs my understanding of this period and of this body of literature. And currently I'm working on, and this is me just kind of placing this talk in the context of my own research. So I'm currently co-writing a chapter on allegory in modern fantasy films. I'm also trying to work these ideas that are the center of this talk into a book on 18th century allegory. And if anyone, and I'll just put this out there, wants to reach out to me, wants to talk to me, we can make this a back and forth. The easiest way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there. Feel free to connect with me, message me. I'm also pretty active on academy.edu. So those are my two kind of social media presences. So feel free to reach out to me. Now, do you want me to stop for you to give your intro at that point, or do you want me to just go forward?
For the audience, I think we are ready to go with the actual lecture, and I hand over the session to Dr. Gulya. Over to you, sir.
All right, great. So I'm just going to kind of dive in. So again, this lecture is going to be about 17th and 18th century British literature and is going to try to imagine, to conceptualize what allegory looked like at that time. And it's really sort of weird, so I'm going to try to unpack it. So what I'm going to do is I want to start everyone off with a lecture map. This gives everyone a sense of where I'm going and where I hope to end up. And so what I'm going to do throughout this lecture is I am going to hop around a little bit, and the goal is to create connections between different examples of allegory, whatever that might be. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what allegory is. It's actually pretty controversial in terms of how we understand, how we define allegory. So I'm going to give just some very quick bare bones definitions, and I'll give everyone a few examples of classic allegory, partially because they very much do inform what happens with allegory throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Then, after I talk about allegory just in general, I'm going to hop over to late 17th century England. So I'm going to talk about John Bunyan, who did Pilgrims Progress, as well as many other very famous, very influential allegories. I'm going to kind of unpack them a little bit. Then from there, I'm going to hop over to Dryden. I'm going to talk about one of his poems and what he does with allegory that is very different, at least to me, or it seems to me, from what Bunyan was doing with his allegory. After I talk about Dryden, and this is where I'm going to jump a little bit, I'm going to talk about A Tale of a Tub. This was by Jonathan Swift, 1704. And that one is a really experimental take on allegory. So I'm going to give everyone a quick intro to that. Then after Swift, I'm going to time-wise, I'll talk about the creation of rules for allegory during the 18th century. It's one of the very strange developments when a lot of literary critics in the 18th century are trying to figure out if and how you can create rules for how allegories are shaped. So that will be an optional section. I'll do that again just based off of timing. Then I'm going to slow down and think about the takeaways. So now that we have these different texts built into the conversation, what can we take away from it all? All right, so that's our lecture map. I want to talk, I mentioned this before, about what allegory is. And again, how people define allegory is really different. There are all these various interpretations of what allegory is. But I'm just going to give you the bare bones. The word allegory comes from two Greek words that were just sort of thrown together. So the first one is allos, meaning other. And the second Greek word that's thrown in there is agoria, which means speaking. And it's often in Greek a term for speaking in a public place. So we often think about allegory as speaking otherwise. That's how it's often defined. So allegory is a form of lying. And that's just a very simple way of putting it, that the idea of allegory is that you can teach someone by telling them a story that's secretly about something else, right? So that there's this recognition that you need to look beyond the surface and trying to figure out what the actual subject of the story is. We often, scholars talk about allegory as rhetorical darkness. Now, what this means is that if you think about lightness, so the opposite, where everything is direct, everything is out in the open. All right, so allegory does something entirely different. Instead of putting the meaning out there for everyone to see, it hides it. All right, so this is a way of thinking about how allegory is a form of lying. All right, it keeps everything hidden. It keeps everyone in the dark, all right, as a way of instructing them. All right, now, another thing I'm going to throw out there, and this gets sort of complicated, is that according to my research, and scholars do not agree on this at all, in my research, allegory can be either a genre or a mode. What I mean by that is a genre. When allegory is a genre, it means that the narrative is fully self-contained, right? It is an allegory from beginning to the end, right? So all along the way, the story is about something else. That is one form of allegory as a genre. Now, as a mode, all right, so a mode in opposition to a genre is something that can be used sparingly from time to time. And this happens all of the time in 18th century texts. It's one of the big changes. So that throughout the 18th century, writers get increasingly comfortable with basically in their text working in a mini allegory, right? And then moving on to something else. So even though the story isn't an allegory overall, the writer uses an allegory. All right, so those are some basic ideas about what allegory is and what allegory isn't. I'm going to throw one other thing out there, one other idea, which is a little bit more complex, but I think that it will help us out. It will help us set the stage for what actually happens with allegory. One way to think about allegory is as a literary form that uses language's ability to have multiple meanings at the same time. This is how that works. So a signifier, so a word that refers to something, right? So the word tree refers to an actual object of a tree is a basic example. So language signifies something else. So a signifier has a primary signified, right? What is actually being referred to in the story, and has a secondary signified. That is a meaning outside the story. And allegory does this as a general rule. Here's an example. If you know Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, so an early modern text, in the first book, the main character is the Red Cross Knight. All right, so the primary signified is an actual knight, all right, going out, fighting enemies, figuring out how to move forward on his journey. So I have on here an actual physical picture of a knight. Now, the secondary signified is religion, is spirituality, right? So as you read Spenser's The Faerie Queene, at the same time that we recognize that it is an actual story about a knight, we also recognize that it is about spirituality, right? That knight is a stand-in, is a representative of the reader's spiritual journey. Now, I mentioned how this talk is about reinventing classic examples of allegory. So just for the sake of getting this information out there, I want to give everyone some quick classic examples that inform what the 18th century is doing. Now, one of the earliest ones is Romance of the Rose. This is obviously a romance. It's about feelings of attraction for another person and how to understand it. All right, the Divine Comedy by Dante is a big example as well. It's extremely famous, extremely influential. It uses the story to think about religion, but also about actual politicians during the period. Piers Plowman is another great medieval example that has visions where the speaker learns about religion by interacting with and talking with personifications. Now, another one is, and I mentioned this before, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. So this is one of the big stories, the big allegories that sets the stage for the 18th century. It is an allegory that is about a knight who is a representative of a person's spiritual journey and all the obstacles that they encounter along the way. Now that we have that done, we have the discussion of allegory and we have a couple of major examples. I want to move into the 17th and 18th centuries, and this will give us a sense of what these writers are doing with this form. The arguably most famous allegorist of all time is John Bunyan. All right, and I have on here an image from early English books online that was from the first printing of the Pilgrims Progress. One of the things I think we miss about John Bunyan is that he was extremely prolific and productive for about 6 years. That's it. He doesn't have that many allegories before this point, and he passes away a few years later. So John Bunyan, over 6 years, transformed the face of allegory, and he did it with a couple of texts. The most famous allegory of all time is the Pilgrims Progress. After that, he did Life and Death of Mr. Badman. It's very infrequently, very rarely read, but it uses many of the same techniques. Then we have the Holy War in 1682, and then the follow-up to the Pilgrims Progress, which was a bestseller at the time. So Pilgrims Progress Part 2 was in 1684. So over this 6 years, Bunyan changes what allegory could look like. So I want to talk about why these allegories are so important, or how they changed allegory. So Bunyan, if you take a look at everything he attached to his allegories, he was actually very anxious about allegory. And one of the reasons he was anxious about it was because of its darkness, right? Darkness, again, is about how you keep the reader in the dark so that they might not know exactly what you are writing about, right? So for Bunyan, one of the worries there was that if that is the case, if allegories are lies, then it's really hard to guide interpretation. It's really hard to get the readers to understand the meaning behind the story. And this made him very anxious, very stressful in terms of using allegory to teach readers about something. One of the ways that Bunyan addresses this anxiety is the use of side notes. All right, so what I'm going to do is I want to give you a page from one of Bunyan's allegories. This is from the Holy War. All right, now I took this again from early English books online. This is how it was originally printed. All right, now the main thing that sticks out to me are these notes on the side of the paragraphs. These are where Bunyan uses the page to get us to read in certain ways. And if you take a quick look at the screen, you will notice that there are side notes of all different kinds. Some of these are references to the Bible. So in the upper right part of the page, you have Bunyan telling us that it's from Ephesians, right? Further down the page, another passage is a reference to the book of Nehemiah from the Bible, right? So you have those sort of side notes. You also have ones that just interpret the story for us. And he does this to address anxieties about guiding interpretation of allegories. Now, the other thing that Bunyan does to change the game for allegory is that he uses a great deal of concrete detail. This is something that Spencer and other writers of allegory didn't really do. So that Bunyan puts in a great deal of concrete empirical detail into his allegory. All right, so that's kind of a general idea. I want to give you a passage to make it just a little bit easier to see how and why he does this. So this is a passage from the Pilgrims Progress by John Bunyan. All right, so this is from the House of the Interpreter scene. So the pilgrim is brought into a room and he's given a scene to analyze. And this is what the text says. This parlor is the heart of a man that was never sanctified by the sweet grace of the gospel. The dust is his original sin and inward corruptions that have defiled the whole man. He that began to sweep at first is the law, but she that brought water and did sprinkle it is the gospel. Now, whereas thou sawest that so soon as the first began to sweep, and the language here is a little bit tricky, the dust did so fly about. So as she swept, dust flies rather than settles. That the room by him could not be cleansed. And people might have experienced this firsthand. If you go into a room, you start just sweeping, it sends dust into the air, and you cannot have it settle. There's nothing you can do at that point. It's just too chaotic, too much. But that thou wast almost choked therewith, right? He's coughing from the dust that's flying about. This is to show thee that the law, instead of cleansing the heart by it working from sin, doth revive, put strength into, and increase it in the soul, even as it doth discover and forbid it, for it doth not give power to subdue. All right, so it's a complicated passage, but there are a couple of things that stick out to me that I want to focus on. The first is that the passage begins by giving us the interpretation, right? So thinking about the side note. So the parlor equals the heart of man, right? It has that sort of equivalency. All right. The dust in the scene is original sin, right? So we can see how early on in the passage, there are all these equal signs. All right. He that began to sweep at first is the law. So that continues, right? She that brought water and did sprinkle it is the gospel. All right. So here, Bunyan is telling us how to interpret the scene and is telling the main character how to interpret the scene, right? So it shows that the story is about something else, right? Now, one passage or one part of the passage I want to focus on is towards the bottom. All right. When the woman and dust is flying all over the place, the main character almost gets choked with the dust. This, to me, is a fascinating moment. One of the reasons that it's so fascinating is that Christian, who's the main character, cannot interpret from a distance, right? The dust actually infects his lungs. It gets into his body. Right? It is extremely concrete. And this is something that earlier writers of allegory didn't really do, right? Showed that kind of concrete detail. All right. And the other thing that I think is important about this passage is in the lower right. And this confirms what I was talking about before with the side notes. We have them here in this passage, right? So or later on in the passage, we have a reference to Romans, a reference to Corinthians, and another reference to Romans. So at the same time that Bunyan is creating his own narrative, he is referring to the Bible all along the way. And he uses these side notes to let us know how he's doing it. All right, now, that was John Bunyan. I'm going to hop away from him. I'm going to talk about John Dryden. And there he is in all of his glory on your page. So John Dryden's allegories will probably feel very, very different than Bunyan. So the one that I'm going to focus on, just for the sake of time, is going to be Absalom and Achitophel. Now, this was printed in 1681. So whereas Bunyan's allegories were Christian allegories that had personifications, right? Personified abstractions. So this one by John Dryden is a political allegory, and it's also a typology. I will let everyone know how that works and what that means in the next slide. But right now, I just want to put that out as an idea. Now, another of John Dryden's experiments with allegory is the Hind and the Panther. This was printed in 1687. It is a partial allegory, and the reason I call it that is that Dryden uses allegory, but only from time to time. And it is about the Protestant Reformation. This poem is almost never read, but it is fascinating. All right. And one of the reasons it's fascinating is the same reason that it's infamous. So if you look at scholarship about this poem, I think one of the things that will stick out to you is that people hate it. It is unpopular at the time. It is unpopular now. And one of the reasons that is the case is because it is very inconsistent. Right? John Dryden uses allegory sometimes and then drops it and goes back and forth and back and forth. So it doesn't feel like the Fairy Queen. It doesn't even feel like the Pilgrims Progress. It feels like its own sort of thing. So what I want to do, for the sake of time, is just focus on Absalom and Achitophel, which we may have heard of, we may have gotten a chance to look through. It is one of Dryden's most famous poems. So I want to give you a page that was printed with one of the early editions, the early printings of the poem. So this would be located at the very end of the poem. So John Dryden included a key. All right, this is very similar to John Bunyan's use of the side notes, right? The only real difference is that Dryden just includes everything at the end. So if you take a look at the page, you will see that John Dryden lets us know how to interpret the narrative. So in the story, Absalom equals the Duke of Monmouth, so a political figure during the time. Achitophel is the Earl of Shaftesbury. You can go down the line, right? So here, the Jews in the story are meant to stand in for Englishmen during the period. So here, Dryden lets us know what the allegory is about. So this story, and I mentioned this before, is both a political allegory and a typology. All right, so in a political allegory, the goal is to give us one-to-one correspondences. So that kind of equal sign. So Absalom equals blank, Achitophel equals blank. That's what a political allegory does, so that it takes people from real life and puts them into the story as someone else. All right, so I think that part will be clear from the page. Now, a typology is slightly different. All right, so in a typology, earlier events predict and anticipate future ones. The main example of this is the Bible. All right, if you read the Bible, you have both the Old and the New Testament. And the principle of it is that events from the Old Testament predict what is going to happen in the New Testament, right? So that everything is predicted, everything is anticipated, so that when we read the New Testament, we get a sense that everything was already foreshadowed by the Old Testament. So Dryden uses that structure so that anything that happened in the Bible predicts what is happening now politically. And that's a really interesting move for the period and even for Renaissance allegory. So I've talked about Bunyan, I've talked about Dryden. And again, I've tried to make this talk so that I'm jumping back and forth between a couple of texts. So I want to hit pause. I want to hit time out just to think about what we've talked about so far. All right, so on the one hand, we have Christian allegory. So this is John Bunyan. Here we have personifications. They're also called personified abstractions. So if you run across someone like Faith and Hopeful, right? These are characters that are meant to represent concepts, right? And they're religious concepts. Bunyan uses allegory to think through abstract concepts, right? Thinking about what spirituality means during the period. And he also refers directly to the Bible as a pretext, right? And that's what he's doing with the side notes when he tells us what parts of the Bible he is referring to as he creates this narrative. So that's Christian allegory on the one side. On the other side, we have political allegory. And this is John Dryden, right? Especially in Absalom and Achitophel. So here, instead of the focus being on personifications, we have a focus on one-to-one correspondences. So this person in the story equals this person from real life. So it's a very different kind of feel to it. And then this is all based off of thinly veiled references. And Dryden, in his poem, will tell us, and he does this with the key as well, as we've seen, he tells us how to read it. All right, and Dryden also uses allegory as a method for criticizing someone politically. He takes this from Dante. If you take a look at Dante's Inferno, all right, so it is a story, it is an allegory about Christian spirituality, but it's also an allegory that criticizes real life politicians. And Dryden takes that and he uses it to his own advantage. Now, I want to go back for a second. So once we do this, when we look at Bunyan's use of allegory and Dryden's use of allegory, we get a sense that allegory has different futures. There are so many different forms of it that during the 18th century, they can move in opposite directions. So that was our pause. That was our timeout. Now, things get a little bit more complicated. And the way that I'm going to complicate the story is by giving you one particular example. It's going to be Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was very dedicated to figuring out how allegory could be used for satire, to criticize someone, to take someone to task for what they have done. The main example I'm going to give you is Tale of a Tub. This is printed in 1704. This narrative, this text alternates, and this is the basic structure. It alternates between an allegory that is about religion and digressions. These are essay-feeling sections when Jonathan Swift talks about 18th century culture. So Jonathan Swift goes back and forth and back and forth. By the end, the allegory has broken down. So if you take a quick look on your own time at that poem and how it's structured, one of the things that sticks out is that the last two sections are actually really hard. So it's hard to figure out if they're meant to be part of the allegory or meant to be part of the digressions. And that is on purpose. At least this is my argument. And what Jonathan Swift is doing is he's showing how allegory could be broken down, right? How it could be taken apart for the writer's own purposes. Now, another way of thinking about this is it starts off as a split up allegory, right? So that is another version of an example of allegory as a genre. So a self-contained narrative, and it's just broken up along the way. So he starts with that, but at the end, he ends with modal allegory, right? Allegory as a mode. And as I mentioned early on in this lecture, the idea with using allegory as a mode is that you could do it for a little bit of time and then move on to something else. So this becomes a method for using allegory, but not writing what you can classify as an allegory. So I want to give everyone a passage. This is a paragraph from A Tale of the Tub. All right, it is long, it is complicated. We are not going to hit everything. I just want to give everyone the basic bare bones. All right, so here is a passage from A Tale of a Tub. So again, the allegory here is about religion. All right, and it focuses on three brothers who have been given a will by their father. So their father has passed away. All right, and the joke is that the three brothers try to read the will in a way that serves their own interests. So in the will, it says things like, don't add certain things to your coat, to your shirt. All right. And so the brothers, as they go along, they try to figure out how to read the will in a way that allows them to add whatever they want. So here, with that context, is the passage. However, after some pause, the brother, so often mentioned for his erudition, so his smartness, his intelligence, his education, who was well skilled in criticisms, had found in a certain author, which he said should be nameless, right? You don't quote your source, that the same word, which in the will is called fringe. So the will says, don't add a fringe to your jacket, right? And a fringe is just a little strip that is meant to be fashionable during the time period. So that fringe does also signify a broomstick, right? So they're basically looking at a dictionary and looking at not just the first definition, but the 10th definition or the 11th definition of the word fringe. And doubtless ought to have the same interpretation in this paragraph. This, another of the brothers disliked because of that epithet silver. So you're given little clues about what the will actually says. So the will says never to add a silver fringe to your coat, to your jacket. And so the brother says fringe could mean broomstick. And then another brother hops in and says, then what do you do with the word silver? All right, now then it continues, which could not, he humbly conceived, in propriety of speech, right, without being nonsense, be reasonably applied to a broomstick. But it was replied upon him that this epithet was understood in a mythological, and this is our key word, allegorical sense. However, he objected again why their father should forbid them to wear a broomstick on their coats. All right, this is the joke. This is where Jonathan Swift is playing with language. A caution that seemed unnatural and impertinent, so irrelevant, doesn't make any sense, upon which he was taken up short as one who spoke irreverently of a mystery, which doubtless was very useful and significant. So the brother asks him, so a brother says to him, that is nonsense. And the brother who's trying to read this story in a certain way says, don't speak badly of our father, right? That's really what is at the heart of this passage. But not to be over curiously pried into, don't look into it, don't think about it, or nicely reasoned upon. And in short, their father's authority being now considerably sunk, this expedient was allowed to serve as a lawful dispensation. So this just means that it gives the brother who wants silver fringes on his coat the ability to do it, right? And still supposedly be following the will of the father for wearing their full proportion of silver fringe. I know that's a long passage. I know that's a complicated passage. I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm just going to give everyone a couple of main things that stick out to me. All right. So we have this language of the mythological and the allegorical in the middle, right? So here the focus is on interpreting a story as an allegory if that story isn't meant to be one. Right. So if you take anything, right, it doesn't matter. You take any story, you could read it as an allegory. There's no reason that the story would stop you from doing that. Right. As interpreters, we have a great deal of control over what that story means. All right. So we see this sort of absurd allegorical reading, right, where fringes equal broomsticks. Doesn't make any sense. It's not meant to, right? And then we also see built into Swift's paragraph this discomfort by the brother, right? So one brother is uncomfortable because the other brother is trying to warp the text, right? Read it in a way that isn't fair, right? And that brother pushes against them, says, don't speak ill about the story. This is a way of thinking about people who interpret the Bible allegorically, right? So Swift is having fun with it. So why is that passage so important? One of the reasons it's so important is that this, and this is the case with much of A Tale of the Tub, is an allegory about allegorical interpretation, right? So it makes fun of how someone can read something as allegory at the same time that it uses allegory. That's extremely complex, extremely weird. It's okay if we all find it confusing. It's that kind of balancing, right? The use of allegory with making fun of allegory. Right. And that is throughout the story. All right. So, and I mentioned this already, it balances the use of allegory with a critique of allegory and making fun of it, showing allegory and allegorical interpretation as foolish. Now, the other reason this passage is so important is that it works allegory into a satire. So it actually takes different genres and throws them together, right, in a single passage. All right, and that's extremely important for what happens throughout the 18th century. Now, we've hit that optional point. I've been talking for about half an hour, 35 minutes. So I'll do the quick version of this. All right, so throughout the 18th century, literary critics are faced with this problem. And it actually comes out of experiments like A Tale of a Tub. All right, so this narrative and other uses of allegory lead critics into a problem that they need to solve. And this is it. If writers could use modal allegory, so again, that just means when you can use allegory in miniature and then move on to something else. So if writers could do that in a variety of genres, who made the rules for how and when allegory could be used? What is preventing this use of allegory as being chaotic and random and all over the place? This is what causes literary critics to retroactively, so going back in time, create rules for allegories. And this is fascinating to me because what writers basically do is they try to create rules for allegories that sometimes don't work for the classic examples, right? The rules they create aren't necessarily useful or accurate for understanding Dante's Inferno or Spenser's The Faerie Queene. All right, so one of the key examples during the period is John Milton's Paradise Lost. If you know Paradise Lost well, you know that there are these personified abstractions, right? Sin and death as the two main ones that interact with other characters in the text. So many critics, and this includes Samuel Johnson, there he is on your screen, and Joseph Addison, right? So these critics and others try to create rules, right? So one of the things that Samuel Johnson said, and I find this really interesting, is that John Milton in Paradise Lost should have found a way to keep personified abstractions like sin and death separate so that they cannot interact with literal characters, right? People who are meant to exist in the world of the story. So Johnson says Milton should have kept them separate. They should have been able to interact. So this isn't really fair to Milton, and it's not meant to be fair, right? And it doesn't work for a lot of allegories. So Johnson and Joseph Addison and others create these rules at the end of the century that they're just throwing on to earlier texts. They're projecting onto them. So now we've hit that part of the talk when I want to just conclude and talk about the chief takeaways of what allegory looked like in 17th and 18th century British literature. So during this period, allegory was a flexible tool. I would argue, and my research does argue this, that the 18th century is one of the things that helps make allegory the flexible, random tool it is today. If you look at modern examples of allegory, and I'm more than happy to talk about this in the Q&A if people are interested. If you look at modern examples, you will notice that allegory is extremely flexible. It tends to be a mode rather than a genre. The 18th century is one of the reasons that this happens. Allegory for the 18th century is also, and I mentioned this especially with Jonathan Swift's, a technique that could be combined with other genres. So you can have a text that is a satire as well as an allegory, right? That kind of mixing is very much a part of what the 18th century was doing. And then the other thing I will say, and this is sort of a mantra of mine, that allegory was a subject of creativity. And my mantra is anxieties about allegory. And we saw those in John Bunyan, and we see them throughout the period. Anxieties about allegory fuel innovation. It doesn't get writers to abandon allegory. It gets them to play with it and mess with it and see what it could look like. And that sort of innovation is what drives the period. All right. And then the last thing I will say, and then my lecture is over, is that when we look at allegory in a prolonged way, and I mentioned this by putting Bunyan aside John Dryden, we have a kind of renewed understanding that different allegories, different kinds of allegories have different futures. That allegory isn't just one thing. It isn't just one genre or mode. It is all these different things. It can be Christian allegory. It can be political allegory. It can be some other form of allegory. So I think that, especially in terms of connecting the 18th century to what is happening right now with allegory, I think it's important to focus on these different futures. And that is my talk. Thank you for humoring me. Thank you to Lit Rio for giving me a chance to talk about this extremely strange body of literature. And so thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gulya. That was such a very interesting session that we had, and I don't think that anyone could have made it into a much simpler concept as you have done with the allegories. But you have given so many different perspectives towards a singular topic that has been something that is less familiar to every student of English literature, because when people talk about English literature, they tend to ruminate upon the romantic writers, the Victorian novelists, but only a few people tend to concentrate upon those writers of the Augustan age, if I happen to say it like that. But you have made it a point to bring in all the great examples, great classic examples of allegories like Paradise Lost, Pilgrims Progress, and many works of John Dryden that many students will not have the chance to read or get to know about it. So some of our audience are just waiting to get their questions answered, but I think it's my turn first to ask some questions regarding the session that we had right now. The first question would be that you talked about how John Bunyan focused his allegories entirely upon religious aspects. You talked about the religious concepts being his center of focus, where he talked about how he used personifications to bring about the important uses of religion. And you told that Dryden spoke about the political aspect of it. And can you ruminate upon any other type of allegories that other writers could use apart from religion and politics?
Yeah, so it's interesting because those two main categories is how we tend to approach allegory, but they're all different ones that mix them. And so the main one that is just so complicated that I mentioned but didn't go through too much is John Dryden's The Hind and the Panther. If you get a chance to take a look at that, one of the reasons that it is so weird is that it is both a political allegory that's making fun of people, but it also has personified abstractions in it. So the hind is one section of the church, the panther is another section of the church. So it combines everything, and that's one of the things that I think made it so weird. And so you have that as kind of a weird combination. Another form of allegory that I didn't mention too much is the romanticism. So it's a French term. And so basically, if you take a look at de la Riviere Manley, she has a bunch of things written like this at the end of the 17th century. So it's related to political allegories, but is a little bit different. So in a romantic play, the basic idea is that you tell a story, right? And everyone recognizes that it's about someone else, right? So if I were to just pick a random celebrity right now, right, who's ever big, whoever I want to make fun of, I could create a story and then find a way to let everyone know that it's about that person. So it doesn't go as far as political allegory because it doesn't have like a set of correspondences. It doesn't do that work, but it is a reference to someone else, and we all know that. And that is extremely popular throughout the 18th century in England and in France. So that is another form of allegory that's sort of in the middle.
Oh, thank you so much. I think you have touched upon every form of allegory that has been present in the 17th century and as well as in the 18th century. When you talked about the actual texts that you happen to make your research upon, and as you have displayed those texts, you pointed out how those texts, those writers actually used reference markers like the side notes, as well as, for instance, Dryden used this particular thing called the keys. And can you illustrate upon how a person can actually read allegories? For instance, poetry is complicated in its own right because it is open to so many different interpretations. But if we happen to talk about allegories, the problem is multiplied. So, can you suggest a particular way or a particular exercise of actually reading allegories?
Yeah, so it's such a complicated question because how allegories are printed throughout the 18th century really changes. So Bunyan puts these side notes telling us how to read them at the end of the 17th century. And then by the time those same texts are being printed 30 years later, they're not including the side notes. They're cutting them out. And if you take a look at and I didn't get a chance to work this into the lecture, but if you take a look at Alexander Pope's The Dunciad, right, which is another poem that uses allegory, uses personifications, but you don't have side notes. You have these really long footnotes at the bottom of the page. And so if you read something like that, it's really, really hard to do, right? To focus on all the things that Pope is referring to. And I think that that's done on purpose. I think that if you look at the Dunciad, one of the jokes is that, and this is very much connected to my experience of reading allegory and what it sort of feels like, you might find a page that the poem takes up this much space, but the note takes up this much space. It might be 80% notes. And in some ways, I think that's what allegory feels like, just on a personal level, that you're meant to read a paragraph of a story and come away with all these ideas. And as you go through the 18th century, that sort of fades away. And I think that that's one of the big things that happens. So that instead of having marginal notes, you suddenly have footnotes. Then by the end of the 18th century, the footnotes fade away. And in modern examples, right, I can refer to a couple of them. If you ever see the movie Inside Out by Disney Pixar, they have all these personifications, anger, joy, disgust, and they're just sort of floating around, and having the ability to kind of read those as personifications opens up the film, but it also feels sort of unnatural, right? It feels like you're projecting onto it. And I think that in some ways, that's just how allegory feels.
I think you have explained it to the core, and it would have made our audience read allegories in a much easier way. And I have just one more question. You touched upon the topic of rules of allegories. You told about how critics of every age, like Dryden, try to give certain rules to allegories in order to judge them as well as in order to interpret them. How far have they succeeded? Have the rules of writing allegories been projected in a much more stable sense?
I actually think they've been very successful because so when you look at someone like Samuel Johnson or Joseph Addison, they're very interested in questions about consistency, how you can create allegories that are internally consistent. And I think those rules have largely, not all the time, but have largely carried over to today, right? To 2021. And I mentioned Inside Out. So I'll kind of use that as an example. But if you watch that movie, you have these personifications. They all exist in the main character's head. They're not out in the world. They're not interacting with people. So with the main character, Riley, the personified abstractions in her mind would fight something out. They would decide on something and she would do it, right? It's an allegory that's about emotion, right? What happens when you're 8 years old and anger wins? What do you do? What does that get you to perform as an action? But one of the things that that movie does in keeping the personifications in our head is it follows a rule that was created by Samuel Johnson, right? When Samuel Johnson says keeps them separate, right? So that those personifications aren't going grocery shopping or going out and speaking at a lecture. They're not doing that because that would be weird. Johnson creates that, and it follows into the present day. And this is across the board. If you if you watch the movie The Seventh Seal, which was by Ingmar Bergman in the 1950s, so that is about a medieval knight who is playing a chess game with death. And if he loses, he and his family dies, right? That's the premise of the movie. But one of the things that they do is they make it so that only the main character can see death. So what they do is they make him separate. He's not interacting with anyone else. He's invisible to everyone else. So they're actually following rules that are created by the 18th century that Edmund Spenser didn't have, even John Milton didn't have, right? They're created 50 years later or so. So I think that they've been pretty successful, but we just lose touch with it because we focus on the modern as opposed to the 18th century versions.
So wonderfully put, those answers were. And the questions from my side are over, but our YouTube audience has some questions that they want to ask you. So we have this question from Luca Cameron, and she asks, can you tell us something about the legacy of Protestant allegory in 18th century fiction?
Yeah, so I think that the focus on Protestant allegory is so interesting because as you kind of track it throughout time, and this is just kind of the premise of what happens with allegory, it becomes more and more secularized so that it moves from the religious space into the non-religious space, whatever that may be. And we can sort of argue about what that kind of looks like. But in general, I think what has happened is, and I take this from ideas of political theology, that secularized concepts don't come out of nowhere. They actually are ways of retooling, repurposing things like Protestant allegory. So they just kind of move into the secular space. And I think that is what has happened, right? When you look at, and I've thrown these examples out there already, so I'll continue to use them just to make it easier. But when you look at something like Inside Out and Seventh Seal, I actually think the legacy of Protestant allegory is absolutely there, right? I think that it continues to be influential because Protestant allegory, even, with someone like Spenser or even someone like Dryden, right? Dryden's use of allegory is in some ways pushing against the Catholic Church. So he has a very specific Protestant meaning to it. And this is one of the things he's doing with Absalom and Achitophel and even Hind and the Panther, right? So Dryden is very much a representative of Protestant allegory, and that moves into the present day, even though we kind of lose the religious aspect of it, but it continues to be there. I don't think it goes away.
Well said. And we have this another question from Travis Lapon. And the question goes like, not all symbolism is allegory. How would you explain this statement?
Yeah, so romanticism is extremely important when it comes to that sort of distinction. One of the things that I find both exciting and frustrating about looking at something like the 18th century is that they didn't have vocabulary for making that distinction yet. They kind of do in practice, right? You have these stories that are meant to be symbolic as opposed to allegory, but they don't have that concept yet because it's not quite created, at least in my research, until we get to the Romantic period. Coleridge absolutely makes that distinction and makes it consistently. Someone like John Milton or John Dryden or John Bunyan, I don't know if they quite did, right? But you can see how once we have that language, right, of symbolic language versus allegorical language, we can project it back onto them. And in some ways, and this is just my own personal opinion, using symbolic language is just a really, really specific use of something like modal allegory, right? The big difference for Coleridge between symbolic language and allegorical language is an allegory takes place over time. It takes you paragraphs or pages or hundreds of pages to create an allegory. A symbol you could do quickly, right? You can just work it in there. So if you were to say, in a story, that coaster or that bowl is symbolic for blank, you don't have to spend that much time on it, right? You can kind of work it in there. You can come back to it, which is just a very specific form of, a certain mode of language. That's how I kind of understand the distinction, but we have to kind of project it onto the 18th century just because I don't think they have that language quite yet.
Oh. So we have this other question from Gustavo Laurel. Why do writers choose to write allegories?
Yeah, it's one of the questions I come back to again and again. I think there are a couple of reasons for it. And the answer will largely depend on the author that you pick. So for Bunyan, and he is probably the most honest with this, if you look at Pilgrims Progress, or actually really all of his allegories, he has these apologies, right? These sections at the beginning of each text where he talks about why he chose allegory, why he chose that particular form. And one of the things that he talks about, that he writes about, is how when you try to teach someone something, they don't want to know they're being taught. We actually have this in modern culture, right? If you're a professor or a teacher, one of the tools you have is to kind of trick people into learning, right? And this is actually built into how allegories work, that if you want to teach, say, a 12-year-old about what it means to be religious, you actually might get more out of telling them a story about a knight who has all of these battles with dragons. You might get more out of that than, say, having them read the Bible or telling them this is how you become religious. So for Bunyan, it is very much a way of tricking readers into learning something. And he kind of has that. Now that's the version of Bunyan from Bunyan. So, but if you look at someone like Dryden or Swift, the answer is really, really different. So by the time you get to Swift, readers and writers too are increasingly skeptical about allegory and even more so allegorical interpretation. So when Swift uses it, he uses it because it seems like the whole project of reading something as an allegory is a joke. And not just that, it can be evil, right? And this is just one of those truths of interpretation. It was the case then, and it's the case now, that if I want to read something in a certain way, I could do it. I could warp the meaning of that text in any way that I want, right? This is just confirmation bias. We can do it in the internet even, right? If I want to create an argument, I can find the information to supply it. And so for Swift, I think that's why he chose allegory, right? Because it has that history and because allegorical interpretation has become so problematic, I think that's the reason why he says, I need to use it. But in general, I think writers during the period use it because it does have that ability to instruct another person by lying, right? It kind of tricks them into it. So I think that the age in general kind of sides with Bunyan in some ways over Swift, but they're all different kinds of answers depending on the author.
And now we have the final question from our YouTube audience, and that would be from Priyadarshini. And she asks, how do you differentiate allegory and parable?
And what, sorry?
How do you differentiate allegory and parable?
Oh, and parable. Yeah. So it's one of the things, and I mentioned this before about the 18th century, is that the language is extremely inconsistent. They will use them sometimes synonymously. But there are a couple of ways that I've learned to distinguish them. Part of it is just how seriously you take the main narrative, right? So in a parable, and this is just using biblical versions of it, right? They're meant to be just baseline, instructive, something that you tell in a few paragraphs and then you explain immediately, right? So, parable of the mustard seed from the Bible, right? Saying, here's a mustard seed. This is what happens to it, right? It has this sort of bing, bang, boom about it, right? It's all about efficiency in a parable. Allegories aren't. They're not often about efficiency. So, and I will use the book in front of me. So, The Fairy Queen, right? Edmund Spenser. It's a really long book. It keeps going and going and going and going and going, right? So it is meant to bring you into that universe in a way that a parable just doesn't, right? A parable is just about you use it to explain something and you get out of there, right? So if you were to take the parable of the mustard seed and you were to make it the premise of a really lengthy language, you could make it into an allegory. I don't think anyone would read it, but you could do it. But I think it really has to do with how serious the narrative is taken on its own terms. I think in an allegory, it's taken pretty seriously. And a parable, often it is not. The story is just a way of getting at something.
So well said. I think all our audience should have been much amused by all those answers that you gave. And I would like to just point out that from this session, I allowed two distinct concepts that you brought in. And one would be that defining allegory as something like keeping the reader in the dark. And another thing was that I found that very fascinating. And the other thing was that you told how allegories are meant to trick people into learning something that they do not want to. I think that was something fresh that I have never heard before. And we had a very an interesting session in this particular episode of Expert Library, and our audience also enjoyed this. I enjoyed it, I guess. With that said, Dr. Jason Gulia, we thank you. All of us from Litreal are very glad to have you for the fifth episode of Expert Library. But before you go, I would just like you to address our audience and bid them farewell before you go.
Yeah, and I really appreciated it. I love getting talk about these sort of weird things that even if we've heard of them, we may not have gotten a chance to read them. And, Sakti, you refer to, people knowing of John Dryden, but not reading him. That's sort of like my wheelhouse, these weird stories that no one really reads now. But they're fun, they're weird, they're experimental. So I really appreciated getting a chance to talk about them. And I love the question, all of the questions, and they gave me a lot to kind of think about and now hopefully get me to change my research, revise my research, and get back to writing too. But I appreciated it. Thank you for the opportunity. It was fun.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Gulya. And to our audience who are watching us live right now, you would have all known about our big event this Sunday, where we will be launching the official website of Litreal, which is perhaps the only online course provider in the world which is exclusive to the study of English literature. And I hope you will all join us this Sunday at 6 p.m. And with that said, this is Prem saying goodbye, and see you in the next episode of Expert Library. Thank you.